This breeze, which has traveled from the regions towards which I am advancing, gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. Welcome to the first mini episode of Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein. I'm Sophie Marie, and this is the podcast where I am attempting to watch every single film adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This mini episode is going to be looking at the first 3 episodes of the 2016 English drama, The Frankenstein Chronicles. I do want to give some content warnings before I move on. The content warnings for this episode include child murder, mutilation, references to sex work, STIs, grave robbing, harmful medical practices, and the exploitation of poverty. So just letting you guys know. The Frankenstein Chronicles first appeared on ITV Encore, but now can be actually found on Netflix. And the real reason that I really wanted to start watching this show is the lead is played by the wonderful Sean Bean. So this episode is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to give you a brief breakdown of each of the first 3 episodes. There are 12 episodes in the series altogether, so there will be 4 of these mini episodes diving into this show. I'm going to give sort of my first initial takes or analysis just from the one-time watching, and then I'm going to do a final longer episode after I've covered all 12 episodes where I kind of deep dive into my actual full analysis of the show overall. I won't be giving a play-by-play of all the details from each episode, but I do plan to discuss the basic plot points of each and then give a little bit of my thoughts on the specific themes that from the novel that are being explored. And then, yes, there'll be a longer episode at the end. So for episode 1, the synopsis says, during an operation to catch a gang of opium smugglers, Detective John Marlett, played by Sean Bean, uncovers a body on the bank of the River Thames. Upon examination, the corpse is revealed to be an amalgamation of body parts from up to 8 children. Home Secretary Robert Peel, who's played by Tom Ward, orders Marlett to quietly examine the matter. Marlett enlists the help of a vagrant boy who claims to have been told of a monster snatching children from the Smithfield Market area in the dead of night. Marlett suspects that some of the body parts may belong to the local butcher's daughter, Alice Evans, who mysteriously disappeared just over a week ago. With the help of Constable Nightingale, played by Richie Campbell, Marlett identifies a public house where he suspects some of the children may have been held. So this episode, it's really atmospheric, just sort of from the get-go. Everything is in these sort of gray tones. The acting is quite somber. To me, it feels, just from the get-go, very grim-dark, which would be, dark world, dark people, or bad world, bad people kind of atmosphere. My first initial thought when I started this was I definitely thought that it was going to be an adaptation of Frankenstein. That is not like a direct adaptation where maybe they were investigating Victor. That's not the case. I will come back to that plot point later. So upon first starting watching this show, I realized, oh, this is based in Britain, not in Germany or Austria, which then later makes sense. And I looked it up. The first episode and the first season takes place at approximately 1827 in London. I'm just looking at some of my original notes. We pretty quickly get a sense that Detective Marlett has a tragic backstory. Potentially, there's reference to his wife and child being dead. This comes up in flashbacks throughout pretty much all of the first 3 episodes. I think it's by the end of the first episode, we learn that he has syphilis, and this is most likely what has killed his wife and daughter. He is then given mercury pills by a doctor at the end of this episode, and the doctor makes clear that this may cause hallucinations, which does happen towards the end of this first episode, which comes back a little bit later, and I will dive into that in the way that I kind of think it's weird. Then we have Nightingale, who I am, again, going to touch on a little bit later. A lot of my thoughts while watching this first episode was, okay, take this down, save it for later, because there's a lot of really interesting threads that are planted in that first episode that some get developed over time and most don't. But I do want to point out that Nightingale is the only Black character in the entire show. And I do, having only watched the first 3 episodes, have some things to say about his characterization. A little bit pulling back, there is a conversation that I would like to have really quick that is more of a historical conversation that is brought up quite quickly in the show. The medical examiner and John Marlett discuss the use of stolen cadavers in medical schools at the time. So they originally think that the killer, who has basically cut up children and sewn them back together, may be either a medical student or someone who is trying to stop the Anatomy Act that is actively trying to be pushed in 1827. It does become a bill in 1832. And the Anatomy Act itself was an act of parliament that gave free license to doctors, teachers of anatomy, and medical students to dissect donated bodies. And it was enacted specifically because of the illegal trade of corpses. So that illegal trade mostly included medical teachers or medical students paying grave robbers to steal the bodies of very recently interred people. And those people most of the time were poor people or people who had been in prison, people who had been in mental institutions, pretty much anyone that society thought or that the medical schools thought would not be missed, or that their families wouldn't have the capability to request that their bodies not be stolen. So that's what the Anatomy Act was enacted because of. So they think that this person may be dissecting these bodies and sewing them back together in a way to horrify the masses into saying, no, we shouldn't let people donate their bodies in this way. At the very end of the episode, we meet a Pied Piper type character who is he's a pimp, and it's kind of unclear if he is connected directly with the murder, but he has been connected with several missing children. And then because of this, one of the girls that he has in his, I don't want to say possession, but in his home is a sex worker named Flora, who does come up later. She is actually a character later. After finishing this first episode, the few notes that I took were that I felt it was a little bit melodramatic in tone. I was really intrigued to see where it was going. It was one of those things where it just kind of hit you over the head with how brooding it was. And I brought up earlier the tragic backstory and of Marlett. And in this first episode, he, to me, kind of felt overly reminiscent of the trope of the lonely or tragic detective / great minds who keeps people at bay so he can do his work. And I was hoping, as the show progressed, that he might actually become more of a unique character for us as an audience to view this monster and his work through. I do think that begins to happen by the end of episode 3. Episode 2. After his discovery on the banks of the Thames, Inspector Marlett visits the house of artist and printmaker William Blake, who was on his deathbed. William Blake then points him to a poem about a missing girl, and a woman who is at William Blake's bedside basically scolds Marlett and asks him to leave. They also look into a specific grave robber who has just stolen a recently deceased child's body, and they ask him to basically become an informant to see if he can find who might be digging at people, not necessarily to sell them, but for gross mutilation acts. And the grave robber himself says that he doesn't think the killer or monster, we don't actually know if this person has killed anyone yet or if he's just desecrating corpses, might not be someone trying to harm the Anatomy Act, but might be someone actually who's maybe pro the Anatomy Act and is trying to undercut the grave robbers and the grave robbing trade. So, as this episode progresses, we find out that the woman at William Blake's bedside is actually Mary Shelley. Like, she is a character, which I was flabbergasted. And in this, it is canon and in the world that the novel Frankenstein has indeed been published a little over 10 years earlier. I thought this was really interesting use of the source material. And that's what I said earlier, is I thought this would be an actual adaptation of Frankenstein, but this is much more, I think, a meditation on the themes of Frankenstein and uses the novel as a lens that then Marlett goes on to view the crimes through. He actually reads the novel in the end of episode 2. So we do get to see, in the tradition of most Frankenstein adaptations, a demonstration on bioelectricity. I think there's something really interesting in the way that this show shows the historical dialogue that was happening at the time, whether it be about the Anatomy Act or the concept of bioelectricity, the concepts that medical science were gaining at the time. As a viewer who has a pretty good grasp on English history at that point in time, I personally didn't need those things, but upon talking to a few other people who aren't as sort of cued into that era, they said that that would be really helpful for them to kind of understand why these things were important and why they would be important in the storytelling for this world or this version of England. This episode does bring in kind of I don't really want to say it's a pet peeve or something, but there's a conversation that feels very strangely moralizing, but not in a way that makes me as an audience member sit back and think. One thing that is very common, and I talked about this briefly in the episode on Victor Frankenstein, the debate over playing God in the novel and in most adaptations of Frankenstein. That is a huge theme. The second episode brings in a character who is discussing with Marlett why she is against she personally is against the Anatomy Act, but that is not because she thinks that just poor people should be, like, have their bodies used for dissection. She thinks that no one should be dissected. She believes that that will keep people out of heaven. And she posits that this work isn't necessarily, or this mutilation, this amalgamation of bodies isn't necessarily against the Anatomy Act, but an inevitable conclusion of it. This just makes Marlett really suspicious of her and her brother, who is a surgeon, who, because he was not trained by the current medical doctors in London, he was trained in a more holistic way, is directly threatened by this act. And so he believes that she's come to him with this sort of strange moralizing about people not getting into heaven once they've been dissected, as a way to throw suspicion off of her and her brother. But as Marlett continues down his journey, he begins to think, maybe the culprit doesn't have a motive. Maybe it's something we're not thinking of. Maybe it's not political. Maybe it's just something in his brain. And that's a question that gets brought up and not answered, and kind of not brought up again in the next, like, this episode and the third episode. I do want to quickly tie back into something I mentioned when discussing episode 1, and that is the subplot of hallucination. So there's a missing girl named Alice. She becomes kind of a point of obsession for Marlett. He is really trying to figure out what happened to her and if her body is included in this sewn together corpse. He ends up in the end of episode 2 hallucinating an encounter with Alice where her wrists are sewn to the hands of another child, and he takes this as to mean that she is already dead, and she's telling him that she's already dead and in the quote-unquote hands of the monster. I don't personally care for this sort of hallucination angle of the story. The rest of the show is rooted in a pretty nice realism. So to have the character like canonically be hallucinating and then take this as sort of almost a spiritual event feels not misguided, not bad, just not necessarily coherent with the story they are telling at this moment. So that is my own sort of personal gripe with that subplot. The final shots of episode 2 are of the royal coroner, who is the person who did the autopsy at the beginning of episode 1, buying a book on bioelectricity. He's seen as being very kind of sus in the last minutes of this episode. So now, moving on to episode 3. In episode 3, having escaped the clutches of the pimp we mentioned earlier, the sex worker Flora shows up at Marlot's home, and she asks for sanctuary, basically. As the investigation continues, Marlot travels to Kentish town to interrogate Mary Shelley. So, this episode pretty much immediately starts with him getting Flora and then meeting Mary Shelley. This scene with Mary Shelley, I want to laugh, but I also don't. She basically serves as a conduit to just hand the audience the themes from the novel and to hand Marlot the themes from the novel. She goes into the meaning of the Prometheus reference from the subtitle and kind of the entire purpose of the horror genre. She talks about how people who write the strange have a reason, and she actually says, "We create things that are strange and uncanny so that men may find themselves reflected." I think this is an interesting choice. I am excited and hopeful that they will use Mary Shelley as more than just sort of a mouthpiece for, here are the themes, this is what we're investigating, and actually make her an element of those themes. In this scene, there are also actually a few kind of nice but sad references to the actual tragedies of Mary Shelley's life. They reference that her mother, all of her children except for her youngest, and her sisters and her husband have all died. She even references being friends with Lord Byron, since they were all famous in their day. And for me, this didn't feel like it actually added anything to her as a character as much as it was just exposition as to why this woman would be writing something so macabre. And I kind of wish that using her life story, again, actually added to the plot or added to her characterization, because she immediately disappears after the scene. Like there is a shot of her packing up her home and leaving. And I don't always personally enjoy this sort of just info and exposition dump through a clueless main character. I get it. There's a lot of history and sort of conceptualness that has to be plopped onto the audience if the audience has absolutely no conception of Frankenstein. But I do almost feel like every single person, whether or not they've read the novel, has some sort of idea of the themes that are being dealt with. So I, again, am returning to something that I briefly mentioned in the short discussion on episode 1. And this is specifically about Flora and Nightingale. So I mentioned that Nightingale is I was actually incorrect. There are 2 black characters, Nightingale and the pimp. So when Flora arrives and is asking for sanctuary, she is assumed to be a teenager. Turns out she's actually a little bit older. She's not 18, but she's like, I think they say she's like 17, and she's pregnant. And as she's asking, she wants an abortion, and the 2 men are trying to figure out how to help her. Neither one of them want to help her get access to an abortion. And Nightingale immediately just says, okay, say it's mine. Like, I'll bring you in as my maid and we'll say that this child is mine. Which is noble, because he's obviously a character of some sort of social standing. But I do feel that it is strange that he's a grown man. He is supposed to be, I think, not much younger than Marlot. And they kind of force this strange, like, he obviously wants some sort of relationship. The way that they behave around each other, it's pretty clear that he is attracted to her. And what makes me uncomfortable so far is this scene is completely dropped. Marlet says, no, we're going to take her to the hospital of the guy that I think might be the killer so she can help be our eyes and ears at the hospital. And it's not brought up again. And I'm hoping as the show progresses, because again, I'm only 3 episodes in, that the overtly sexually domineering coding of the only 2 men of color in the entire show is either dealt with and the show kind of interrogates its own use of that, which I think would be the best outcome, or it doesn't happen again, but I don't know, because it made me quite uncomfortable. And it would have made me uncomfortable no matter what, seeing this sort of weird forced making people assume that they had sex when she is a minor and he is an adult. No matter what, it's weird. The fact that the only 2 male characters who have kind of weird sexuality, or not weird sexuality, but are coded as having a sexuality or a sexual experience with Flora specifically outside of what would have been the norm or accepted, are the only 2 black men in the show. So I wanted to bring that up. I again plan on doing more of an analysis on the actual racial coding of the show in general when I do my final deep dive, but I definitely think that it needs to be mentioned at the very least. So at the end of this episode, Flora is dropped off to the hospital of the woman who earlier in episode 2 gave the sort of rant about people not getting into heaven. He gives Marlet a tour of his facility and shows Marlet that, I'm not some kind of quack. I actually have, medical knowledge. And they finish the tour with the doctor showing Marlet a patient who is in, I think he says like the final or 3rd stage of syphilis, and they've lost their nose. They look very thin and worn. And this is obviously sort of this ploy as to say, I don't think you're being treated, and I think that you should be, because earlier, sorry, I forgot to mention this, in episode 1, the doctor, they meet briefly, and he catches on by seeing a pustule on Marlet's arm that he does indeed have syphilis. I don't entirely know why this sort of fear-mongering scene has to happen, other than to give Marlet another sort of emotional, not climax or arc, but to just add on to the fact that his wife is dead, his child is dead, and that's quote unquote his fault in his mind, and he's has a relatively untreated STI, which is weird because it's made clear that he is treating it with the mercury pills, whether or not we as a modern audience recognize that those don't work is another conversation. Yeah, I don't really know how I feel about that specific end scene. And then at the very end, we do learn in this episode that he has sworn to a priest to not have any sort of sexual contact due to his illness. There is sort of an insinuation that the priest believes that if he were to come into sexual contact with another person, that would be relatively sinful. And that's the first 3 episodes. The investigation continues from episode 1 all the way through. That is a complete through line. It doesn't really progress. By the end of episode 3, I have no idea who is supposed to be the killer. The show 100% is just Marlet's experience of sort of grimy London, of learning about this new and upcoming horror genre, meeting people who are making him question his worldview, and that's it. That's the first 3 episodes. My overall thoughts, I'm intrigued. It's a show where it's not like a fun watch, but it is an intriguing watch. I want to keep watching, even though I definitely see that there are going to be some issues with specifically coding yet again. And I'm nervous about those. I also think that there's some writing but the usage of characters in ways that I don't think are necessarily fulfilling for the story that they're telling. And I hope that those characters become more fleshed out over time. My next mini episode will be about episodes 4 through 6, which is the entirety of season 1. That will be coming in a month. And I'm excited to kind of go on this little TV journey with you guys. If you have any questions or want links to the show, just give me a shout out on Instagram. You can find me at Das Beast Performance at Instagram.com. And you can also find me at dasbeastperformanceproject.com. Thank you all. Now I would like to give a shout out to my $15 and up patrons. You can find me at Das Beast Performance at patreon.com. Those patrons are Jamari Littlejohn, Carrie Morrison, Lois Gallagher, Susie Wilhoft, Joella Oldfield, and Mike Nevin. This episode was written by me, Sophie Marie. It was scored and edited by Otto Schatz and distributed by Buzzsprout.com. Thank you so much.